He gave away his dying horse to a poor boy. But what the boy did next made the whole town whisper his name. He thought it was just an act of pity, handing a broken horse to a boy who owned nothing but belief. Yet that single moment, born of arrogance, would return to haunt him. Because in a forgotten stable, under the hum of silence, a poor boy was about to teach a millionaire what it truly means to be alive. The old racetrack hadn't seen a sunrise worth remembering in years. Rust clung to the railings like dried blood, and the banners that once fluttered with pride now hung in silence. In the middle of the cracked asphalt, a chestnut mare lay trembling, her right foreleg bent in a way no creature should bear. The trainer had already turned away. The vet shrugged. "It's over," someone said. Charles Vane stood beside them in a gray suit that fit his body but not his soul. He looked down at the horse with the indifference of a man who had seen too many losses to feel anything anymore. "Take it away," he muttered, lighting a cigarette that trembled slightly between his fingers. "I don't pay to feed something broken." From the far end of the paddock, a small voice broke through the hum of machinery. "Please, sir, don't." Charles turned. A boy, barely 13, stood clutching a mop handle like a weapon. His clothes were too thin for the cold, his hair matted with dust. Everyone knew him, the janitor's son who worked for coins and scraps. The boy took a cautious step forward. "She can still stand, I swear. Just give me a chance." Charles exhaled smoke through his nose. "A chance?" He looked at the horse again, at the bent leg, the eyes glazed with pain. Then he looked back at the boy. "Fine." He pulled a folded bill from his pocket, a crumpled $5 note, and tossed it onto the ground. The paper landed in a small puddle of blood and mud. "There, buy her." The stable hands laughed. The boy didn't. He walked forward, kneeling beside the horse, his hand brushing the mare's muzzle. She flinched, but didn't pull away. "It's okay," he whispered. "It's okay, Grace." "Grace?" Charles smirked. "You named her already?" The boy looked up, eyes steady. "She already had a name, sir. People just stopped saying it." Something in that answer pierced through the layers of Charles's practiced cruelty. For a brief moment, his eyes softened, but only for a heartbeat. Then he turned away. "Get her off my property by sunset." The mare tried to move, stumbled, fell again. The boy didn't leave her side. He placed his palm over her neck, feeling the faint pulse. His hands were shaking, but his voice was calm. "We'll walk, one step at a time." Charles paused at the gate, watching the fragile determination of the boy. There was something hauntingly familiar about it, the way he once held his wife's hand when the doctors said, "No chance." He ground the cigarette under his heel and left without looking back. By afternoon, the sky had turned a dull silver. Tommy, he had never introduced himself, but that was his name, managed to guide Grace across the empty yard. Each step left a dark print on the concrete, a slow rhythm of survival. The other workers stared, whispering things he couldn't hear or didn't care to. The boy's world had narrowed down to the sound of the mare's breathing, the uneven click of her hoof on the broken pavement, and the faint warmth of her shoulder under his arm. When they reached the far end of the property, there stood a row of abandoned stables, boarded windows, rotted beams, a place that smelled of dust and forgotten victories. He found one stall still strong enough to shelter them. Tommy pushed the door open, guided Grace inside, and collapsed against the straw. His palms were raw, his lungs burning, but there was a flicker of peace. Grace lowered her head, nostrils flaring, and exhaled softly over his face. It felt almost like forgiveness. Night fell fast. The city lights beyond the track blinked through the fog, cold, distant, uncaring. Tommy found a torn blanket in the corner, dipped it in a bucket of water, and wrapped it carefully around the mare's leg. He'd seen his mother bandage herself after long hours cleaning offices, tight, but gentle. "You'll be all right," he whispered, more prayer than promise. "You just need time." Outside, rain began to fall in thin, metallic threads, tapping softly on the tin roof. Each drop carried the weight of a world that wouldn't care if a broken horse or a poor boy disappeared overnight. But in that forgotten corner of the city, two hearts, one scarred, one naive, found the faint echo of something that used to be called faith. At the far side of the racetrack, from the warmth of his car, Charles looked out through the windshield. The wipers swept the rain away, revealing the dim light flickering inside the old stable. He could barely make out the silhouette of the boy kneeling beside the horse. He should have driven off. He almost did. But his hand hovered over the ignition. The sound of the rain reminded him of the night his wife's laughter faded in the hospital room, when he swore never to care again, because caring meant losing. He took a deep breath, turned the key, and the engine hummed to life. For a moment, the headlights illuminated the empty road ahead, wet, endless, quiet. Then he drove away, leaving behind a light that refused to go out. The next morning, the janitor found his son asleep beside the horse, his small hand resting over its chest as if guarding something sacred. Grace was still alive, barely, but alive. And somewhere in the city, Charles Vane woke up in a bed far too big for one man, unable to shake the sound of rain and a child's whisper. "It's okay, Grace. You just need time." The morning came with a fog so thick it softened even the edges of pain. The boy woke to the sound of shallow breathing beside him. Slow, uncertain, but steady. Grace was still there. Her eyes opened to the dim light that seeped through the cracked boards, reflecting the pale hue of dawn. The air smelled of rust, straw, and something faintly sweet, like forgotten hay. Tommy rubbed his eyes, his fingers stiff from the cold, and whispered, "We made it through the night." He stepped outside and found the world muffled, the racetrack distant behind him, the city hidden under mist. It felt as if no one could see them here. And that was strangely comforting. He scavenged for anything useful, old bandages, bottles, torn blankets left by workers long gone. Everything seemed broken, but he learned early that broken didn't mean useless. That morning, he carried back a bucket of water and half a loaf of bread stolen from the trash near the stables. Inside, Grace lifted her head when he entered, nostrils flaring as if she recognized the scent of hope. "You're hungry," he said softly, tearing the bread in half. "So am I." He laughed, not because it was funny, but because the sound felt human. He held the crust near her mouth, and after a moment of hesitation, the horse leaned forward and took it gently from his palm. The touch sent a shiver through him. His first moment of trust returned. By noon, sunlight slipped through the roof like thin ribbons of gold. Tommy used the light as his clock. He wrapped new bandages, cleaned the wound with trembling care. When the pain was too much, Grace would shudder, but never strike. It was as if she understood that his clumsy hands meant kindness. He spoke to her in whispers, about things that didn't matter, his mother's night shifts at the factory, the noise of trains that shook their shack, the way the city lights never turned off even when everyone was asleep. "People don't look at you when you're small," he said, watching the way her ear flicked toward his voice. "But maybe animals do." At the other end of the property, Charles Vane returned to inspect the demolition work. The racetrack was to be replaced by luxury condos, his newest real estate development. Vane Estates, the sign read, bold letters against a gray sky. It was progress, the kind he could measure in dollars and headlines. But as he walked near the old stables, something stopped him. A faint rhythm, not of machines, but of breathing. Two, overlapping. He frowned and pushed the door slightly. The hinges groaned. Inside, he saw the boy kneeling beside the horse, one hand on its neck, the other pressed over his own chest, as if sinking their hearts. Charles didn't speak. The scene froze him in place, the way the boy whispered without moving his lips, the way the mare seemed to listen. It was absurd, yet beautiful. The air between them felt sacred, and he, an intruder. He closed the door quietly and stepped back into the open air. His assistant approached with blueprints. "Sir, the demolition team can start tomorrow." Charles looked at the sign that bore his name, then back at the stable. "No," he said after a pause. "Not yet." That night, Tommy stayed up longer than usual. He drew with charcoal on the wall. Rough lines forming the shape of a horse running, mane wild, legs whole. He wasn't good at drawing, but he didn't care. "We'll get you there," he whispered. Grace shifted, her tail swishing weakly, brushing against his leg. He took it as an answer. Days passed like breaths, one fragile, one strong. Tommy learned her rhythm. When she tried to stand, he steadied her shoulder, murmuring, "Slow, breathe with me." Each day, one more second upright. Each night, exhaustion and straw for a bed. Across town, Charles couldn't sleep. He had closed deals worth millions without blinking, but now, in his penthouse overlooking the skyline, his mind kept returning to that whisper in the stable. He poured a drink, stared at his reflection in the glass, the lines around his eyes, the exhaustion he could never sign away. The news on television spoke of market growth, stock futures, best mortgage rates 2025, all the numbers that once defined his worth. But none of it filled the quiet. He opened an old drawer, found the photo of his wife smiling beside Grace years ago, her hand brushing the same spot on the horse's neck where the boy had touched. It was a small coincidence, maybe, but it felt heavier than logic. He turned the photo face down and sat there until the ice melted in his glass. The next morning, when Tommy stepped out to fetch more water, he found a small crate by the door. Bandages, antiseptic, oats. No note. Just silence. He looked around the empty lot, the fog still hugging the earth. "Thank you," he whispered to the air, though he didn't know to whom. Grace nickered softly behind him, as if she did. Later that day, when she took her first few steps without collapsing, the sound echoed faintly through the hollow stable. Tommy froze, afraid to breathe. Grace stood, trembling but proud. The boy's eyes filled with something new, relief that hurt as much as joy. And somewhere in the city, Charles Vane paused during a board meeting, his mind drifting to a sound he wasn't supposed to hear anymore, the slow rhythm of hooves finding balance. For the first time in years, he felt something close to life pressing against the glass walls of his office. He didn't know it yet, but a boy and a broken horse were rebuilding something inside him that all the wealth in the world had failed to touch. The sound of hooves against concrete lingered in Charles Vane's mind long after the boardroom emptied. It was faint, fragile, like an echo from another life. That night, he told himself it was nothing. A coincidence, maybe the construction crew moving debris, but the image of that boy's hands pressed over the horse's heart wouldn't leave him. He saw it every time he closed his eyes. 3 days later, he returned to the racetrack under the excuse of final inspection. The demolition team hadn't arrived yet. The air carried a stillness that unsettled him, that fragile peace before a truth reveals itself. As he walked past the burned-out signs and the broken fences, he noticed something. Faint prints of hooves in the dirt. They were uneven but determined, like a line of breath refusing to stop. He followed them to the far end of the lot, where the last stable stood, the same one he had ignored for months. The door was half closed, but a beam of morning light leaked through the gap, cutting across the dust like a blade of mercy. He placed a hand on the door and pushed. Inside, he found them, Tommy and Grace, frozen in that golden light. The boy was brushing the horse's mane, his movements deliberate and reverent. The mare's coat, though still dull, carried a sheen that hadn't been there before. The leg, wrapped tight with new white bandages, looked stronger. The boy hummed quietly, a tune without words. It wasn't music. It was survival. Charles didn't speak. He just watched. The brush moved with the same rhythm as the rise and fall of the boy's chest. Every stroke felt like forgiveness written in motion. When the boy finally noticed him, he didn't jump or hide. He simply stopped and said, "She stood by herself today." His voice was soft, but sure. Charles hesitated. "You're wasting your time," he said automatically, though even he didn't believe it anymore. Tommy looked at him. "She doesn't think so." The simplicity of it disarmed him. He wanted to say something cruel, something to restore the distance between their worlds, but the words never came. Instead, he nodded once, a gesture he couldn't explain. He stepped closer, studying the mare. "You should have been gone weeks ago," he muttered. Tommy shrugged. "Guess we both stayed longer than we should have." Charles almost smiled. It had been years since anyone spoke to him that way, without fear, without calculation. He knelt, ignoring the dust on his suit, and touched the horse's neck. Her skin flinched beneath his palm, but she didn't pull away. Her eyes met his, dark, steady, and strangely forgiving. He hadn't realized until that moment how long it had been since he looked another living being in the eye. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a man giving orders. He felt small, human. He stood and cleared his throat. "You keep her here?" "Yes, sir," Tommy replied. "Nobody else wanted the place. It's quiet." "Quiet can be dangerous," Charles said, glancing around at the crumbling walls, the cracked beams, the ceiling that leaked light. "It's all we've got." The boy's words fell like truth does, simple and impossible to argue with. Charles looked again at the horse. "What did you call her?" "Grace." He closed his eyes briefly, the name hitting something deep, something that hurt. His wife used to whisper that word before every race, for grace, not glory. She believed it brought luck. He'd forgotten that until now. Before leaving, Charles pulled something from his coat pocket, a small metal tin of ointment left over from the vet who used to treat his prize horses. He placed it on the ledge. "For the wounds," he said quietly. Tommy hesitated. "Thank you." Charles gave a half shrug. "It's just medicine." But they both knew it wasn't. That night, Tommy stayed up again, watching Grace sleep. The mare's breathing had grown deeper, stronger. He touched the new bandages, then traced the outline of the tin with his finger. The lid had faint initials carved into it, E.V. He didn't know who that was, but he could tell the gesture meant more than medicine. It was an apology trying to find words. Meanwhile, across the city, Charles poured himself another drink, but didn't touch it. He sat at his desk, staring at the photo of his wife beside Grace, taken years ago after their biggest win. Her eyes sparkled with pride, with that kind of warmth that could tame storms. He hadn't visited her grave in 5 years, maybe longer. He turned the frame toward the window, as if ashamed to be seen. The skyline outside was ablaze with neon, the world he had built, the one that had cost him everything that couldn't be bought. The reflection of the glass split his face in two, the man who had everything, and the man who felt nothing. When dawn came, he was still awake. And somewhere near the edge of that forgotten stable, a boy was teaching a broken horse how to trust the morning again. By the end of the week, Charles found himself driving past the racetrack again. He didn't plan to stop, but something drew him back. He parked near the fence, engine idling. Through the open gate, he saw Tommy leading Grace in slow circles, one hand resting lightly on her neck. The rhythm of their movement was patient, almost sacred. The horse stumbled once, caught herself, and kept going. The boy didn't cheer. He just smiled quietly, letting her own strength surprise her. Charles watched without moving. He realized that he had forgotten what Grace actually looked like. Not the word carved on trophies or written in contracts, but the quiet endurance of something that refuses to die when no one believes it can live. For the first time in years, he wanted to remember. By the time the city shook off its morning chill, Tommy had already drawn a circle in the dust with the heel of his shoe. He kept it small on purpose, no farther than 3 careful steps across, so Grace would not have to fear the space beyond her pain. When Charles arrived, unannounced, and pretending he had business elsewhere, he found boy and horse standing at the rim of that circle, like 2 travelers about to cross a thin bridge. "Same circle as yesterday?" Charles asked, hovering in the doorway as if permission were a thing one should earn. Tommy looked up. "Smaller," he said, smiling without a hint of apology. "Today we don't rush." Grace flicked an ear, listening. The new bandages, clean and white, wrapped the mare's fragile certainty like a promise. Dust hung in the light, the kind of quiet weather that lets a heart decide whether to stay or run. Tommy set his palm on the horse's neck. "With me," he whispered. "In and out." His own chest rose, then fell. Grace followed, the breath shaky at first, then steadier, a thread weaving through cloth. Charles stepped inside, shoes crunching on straw. He wanted to say something practical, a warning about weight-bearing, a reminder that a racetrack is no place for miracles, but the words died when he saw the boy's other hand lifting slowly, until it rested over his own sternum. In and out. The rhythm linked them. The mare's eyes softened, the hinge of her jaw unclenched, and a tremor passed through her body like a small wave folding itself into shore. "One step," Tommy said, not to Charles, not to the world, but to the breath itself. He shifted his weight sideways, and Grace edged forward, hoof sliding inside the chalk-pale circle. The movement lasted no more than a heartbeat, and yet it held the patience of years. The boy didn't praise her. He simply breathed again, giving the victory back to the quiet that had made it possible. A truck outside popped its exhaust. Sharp, unexpected. Grace startled, head jerking, leg tensing for collapse. Before the fall could claim her, a figure moved, too fast for a man who wore suits. Charles reached the halter gently, not to restrain but to steady, and his voice came out lower than he remembered it could be. "Easy, girl. You're here." He didn't look at the leg. He looked at her eye. The panic receded like a tide. The mare found Tommy's shoulder with her own and leaned. "You all right?" Charles asked, but the question floated toward both of them. Tommy nodded, surprised less by the scare than by the man's touch. "Thank you," he said, still breathing with the horse. Charles cleared his throat. "Start the step again. The circle hasn't moved." They did. One step. Rest. One step back. Rest longer. Each pause was as important as the movement, the way a silence in a good story says more than the line it stands beside. Tommy whispered a tune with no words, and Grace, as if remembering a room she once loved, settled deeper into the present. When the session ended, Tommy cleaned the leg. Charles watched without comment, though he noted the boy's hands. The economy of care, the way he saved every inch of gauze, the way he turned a strip once used for a saddle pad into a sling. "Where'd you learn that knot?" Charles asked finally. "Mom taught me," Tommy said, concentrating. "She cleans offices at night. Says knots and bills are what keep life together." He said it lightly, but the way his mouth tightened around the word bills betrayed the weight behind it. "We're saving for a better place. Landlord says our rent goes up next month. He keeps talking about improving the neighborhood. But people like us don't fit in the brochure." Charles thought of his marketing decks, of phrases like best mortgage rates and low down payment and approved credit. He thought of the brochures where no one ever looked tired. "Saving is good," he said, and immediately felt how thin the sentence sounded in a room that smelled of antiseptic and straw. Tommy didn't seem to mind. "I've been reading about money," he offered, "about how a best savings account can grow if you leave it alone, like letting a wound heal." He glanced up, hopeful, as if the man before him might confirm that patience pays. "Sometimes," Charles said, softer, thinking of a grief he hadn't dared to let mature. "Sometimes it does." They worked in near silence until midday. A groundskeeper wandered past, peeked in, and snapped a picture with his phone. Tommy stiffened, but the man nodded once, almost respectful, and left. The photograph would float later on a local forum, nameless and luminous, a boy, a broken mare, a suited man with his hand open instead of closed. But for now, the image lived only inside the dust motes, a secret shared among 3 hearts and a shaft of sun. Charles brought back a small bag from his car, oats, a roll of vet wrap, a faded halter he hadn't tossed for reasons he could never admit. "For later," he said, setting them down in a quiet corner, as if speaking loudly might break the spell. He found himself checking the ceiling, the stall door, the old latch. This place needs work. The beam there, see how it bows? I know, Tommy said. I keep a bucket under the leak when it rains. We don't have home insurance, so he shrugged. Buckets are cheap. Charles almost smiled. The boy's simple arithmetic exposed a world of numbers that corporate life hid with gloss. He pulled out his phone to make a note. He did not write charity. He wrote repair. The difference mattered to him more than he wanted to explain. In the afternoon, they tried something new. Tommy drew a second circle, tangent to the first, like two coins kissing. If she chooses to step across, it'll be her idea, he said. Not mine. He stood back. He waited. He did not coax. Grace lifted her head, ears tracking the room, then lowered her muzzle to the line and breathed against the dust. Her foreleg hovered over the boundary, trembling, a bridge suspended between fear and faith. She set the hoof down in the second circle. No drama, no applause. The smallest thing done bravely. Tommy exhaled, a laugh breaking loose from somewhere unguarded. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The sound made Charles turn toward the window so they wouldn't see his eyes. People talk about miracles like thunderclaps. He had forgotten they were more like dew. They rested. Tommy shared the story of how he used to sleep in the equipment room beside the dryers when his mother got a second shift. The machines were loud, he said, but if I pressed my ear to my arm, I could hear my own blood. It made me feel not lost. He stroked the mare's cheek. I think she listens the same way. What about school? Charles asked, because adults are trained to ask it, as if survival had office hours. I go most days, Tommy said. Sometimes I'm late. I'm taking an online education class at the library, free if you watch the ads. They keep pushing credit cards and car insurance and stuff. They say it's security. He smiled faintly. I think security is this, knowing somebody will still be here when you close your eyes. The sentence lodged in Charles like a key finding its lock. He remembered a hospital room, a hand going slack in his, the quiet after the machines stopped. He had left before dawn because staying felt like drowning. He had not forgiven himself for that exit. Not once. Not in all the deals signed, not in the articles about his net worth, not in the interviews about prosperity and the future of urban living. Tommy, he said, and the boy looked up. If you had what you needed, better bandages, proper feed, a vet to check her, what would you do next? Teach her how not to be afraid of doors, the boy said immediately. And then, how to carry someone again, even if it's only a few steps. He touched the mare's shoulder. She won't have to be fast, just willing. The man nodded. Doors first, then. He moved to the stall entrance and stood to the side, widening the space with his body rather than closing it with his presence. Tommy led Grace forward. The mare balked at the threshold. The shadow on the ground looked like a ditch at the edge of her memory. The boy did not tug. He turned, placed his forehead to hers, and breathed until the shadow lost its teeth. One step. The other forehoof followed. She stood in the doorway, framed by light, half in and half out, as if the world were reminding them no crossing is ever clean. From somewhere beyond the fence, a radio crackled with an ad about life insurance, a confident voice promising peace to anyone who could afford their premiums. The words drifted in and fell apart against the beams. Peace, Tommy thought, was not something bought. It was something practiced in small rooms with leaky roofs. They stayed like that for a long time. 3 figures arranged by accident into a composition painters spend careers trying to learn. The boy, the horse, the man, trust moving in slow currents between them. No one raised their voice. No one solved the past. They did the harder thing. They let the present be enough. As dusk seeped into the boards, Tommy guided Grace back into the stall. She stepped over the threshold without hesitation. Progress rarely announces itself. It just doesn't resist as much. The boy rubbed the mare's neck and whispered, "Tomorrow, we try the far end of the yard." Charles nodded. He had meetings in the morning, contracts to sign, analysts to convince. None of it scared him the way leaving this room did. "I'll be here," he heard himself say, and the promise surprised him. He'd avoided promises for years. They were too much like doors. Once you walked through, you could not pretend you were still outside. On his way out, he paused at the old trophy case by the hallway. The glass smudged, the shelves empty, except for a single tarnished plaque. He could see his reflection, a man blurred by his own fingerprints. He wiped a corner clear with his sleeve and laughed at himself, quietly. Then he reached into his coat, pulled out a small envelope, and slid it under the crate of supplies. Inside was a handwritten list of phone numbers: a retired track vet, a farrier who still answered calls after dark, a feed supplier who didn't ask too many questions, and a line drawn under them all: "Call me first." Outside, the groundskeeper who had taken the earlier photo leaned against the fence and watched the suited man lock the stable door from the outside, then test it again, not to keep anyone in, but to keep the night out. The man took one last look over his shoulder toward the sliver of light in the stall and walked to his car. He sat in the driver's seat for a long minute, hands resting on the wheel, the engine off, city noise folding around him like a tired blanket. In the quiet, he felt his heart make room. The next morning, when the first workers arrived with demo permits and paint to stencil new lot lines, they found a note taped to the gate in Vane's clipped handwriting: "Delay East Lot demolition until further notice." Under it, smaller, as if he didn't trust the tenderness of the words, another line: "Respect the stable." By noon, a picture began to circulate in the neighborhood. Grainy, beautiful. A boy at a threshold, a horse choosing light, and a man in a suit standing aside. It would be posted without names, but not without consequence. Attention has its own weather. It was moving in. And when Tommy held up the phone, someone had slipped to him and asked, "Should I show people how we breathe?" Charles looked at the mare, then at the boy, and answered, "If you do, be ready for the noise." He tried to smile. "And for what noise does to doors?" By the end of the week, the photo had circled through town. A boy, a broken horse, a man in a suit standing aside. It was posted without context on local news sites, then picked up by blogs with headlines like "Millionaire returns to his abandoned stable" and "Boy teaches compassion to the rich." The comments came fast: praise, mockery, and the usual noise of people who love opinions more than truth. Tommy didn't have a phone, but his mother showed him the picture on hers. "It's you," she said with a tired smile. "You're famous now." He didn't feel famous. He felt exposed. The stable had been their quiet miracle, and now it was on every stranger's screen. That morning, when Charles arrived, Tommy held up the borrowed phone and asked, "Did you know they took this?" Charles studied the image, then looked at him. "No." His voice was low. "But once a story leaves its home, it never comes back the same." Grace stood between them, shifting her weight, sensing the tension in the air. The stable door was open wider than usual. The light no longer felt safe. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Curious townspeople, a journalist, 2 teenage girls recording on their phones. One of them waved at Tommy. "Smile for TikTok," she said. He didn't. He tightened his hand on the lead rope. Charles stepped forward. "This isn't a zoo," he said sharply. But the more he pushed, the more people wanted to see. They asked questions. Was it true he'd given the horse away for $5? Was it charity? Was the boy his son? Every question carried judgment disguised as interest. Tommy tried to explain that it wasn't about money, that the horse just needed time. But the words came out tangled, too simple for a world that needed drama to listen. That night, the online story hit a national feed. The comments split like a wound. Some called Tommy an angel, others a fool. A few said Charles was exploiting the poor for redemption. He read those words alone in his office, the light from the screen washing his face in sterile blue. He could buy and sell entire neighborhoods, but he couldn't buy silence. By morning, a van from a local news channel was parked outside the racetrack. The reporter had kind eyes, but a hungry microphone. "Mr. Vane," she said, "why help now?" He wanted to say, "Because I finally remembered what love looks like," but instead he said the kind of sentence people expect from men like him. "Everyone deserves a second chance." Tommy watched from the stable door, confused by how words could sound true and hollow at the same time. When the cameras left, the silence that returned wasn't the same silence they had built before. It was heavier, crowded with echoes. Grace paced, restless. Tommy reached to calm her, but she flinched at every sound, the click of a lens, the buzz of a drone above the lot. "She's scared again," he said. Charles frowned. "She'll adjust." But that night, Grace wouldn't eat. She stood facing the wall, muscles tight, eyes dull. Tommy sat beside her until dawn, whispering, "They'll stop talking soon. People forget fast." Yet when he said it, he wasn't sure if he wanted them to forget or to understand. The next day, he arrived to find the gate chained. A new sign hung on the fence. "Private property, no trespassing." His stomach turned cold. He climbed over anyway and ran to the stable. Charles was inside, sleeves rolled, talking to a man in a hard hat. "And they're shutting it down?" Tommy asked, breathless. "Temporarily," Charles said, though his eyes told another story. "City inspectors think the building's unsafe." "Unsafe?" Tommy's voice cracked. "She's fine here." "It's out of my hands," Charles said, too quickly. He looked older that morning, the lines on his face drawn deep. "There are legal things." "Because of the news?" "Because of everything." He sighed, turning away. "You need to take the horse home, at least for now." Home. The word felt like a cruel joke. His mother's landlord barely allowed their dog. There was no place for a horse. Tommy's chest tightened. "You said she was safe here." "I thought she was," Charles replied. "But safety's complicated." The boy stood silent for a long time, then said, "Maybe only for people like you." Charles didn't answer. The hard hat man coughed, muttered something about liability insurance and deadlines. The sound of it felt like metal closing. When they left, Tommy sat in the stall with Grace, stroking her mane. "We can't stay," he said quietly. The mare lowered her head, breathing against his shoulder. He took it as understanding. That evening, he led her out under the dim light of a flickering street lamp. She limped, but followed. They walked through the alley behind the racetrack, past graffiti and broken glass, until they reached the edge of an abandoned field. He tied her loosely to a fence post and spread a blanket over her back. "I'll come back tomorrow," he whispered. "I promise." He didn't see the black car parked across the street. Inside, Charles watched, the engine idling. He'd followed without meaning to. The sight of the boy leading the horse through the empty lot tore something inside him wider than guilt. He had built towers of glass, but he had no shelter for the only two souls who needed it. He sat there until Tommy disappeared into the fog. Then he got out of the car and walked toward the mare. Grace flicked an ear, wary but calm. Her breath steamed in the cold air. He reached out, touched her muzzle, and for the first time since his wife's death, said aloud the words he had once whispered only to her. "You did good, girl." The horse didn't understand the language, but she understood tone. She leaned forward, resting her head briefly against his chest before pulling away. He stood there, motionless, the sound of distant traffic humming like a ghost of applause. Back in his penthouse, Charles read the new headlines, "Millionaire's PR stunt backfires," and closed the laptop without anger, only exhaustion. He looked around the apartment, clean, silent, perfectly staged. It felt more like a showroom than a life. He poured himself a glass of water, stared at the reflection in it, and said to no one, "Safety's complicated." The next morning, Tommy returned to find the blanket gone. The mare, too. Panic gripped his throat. He ran toward the racetrack, shouting her name, until he saw the old stable door open again. Grace stood inside, eating fresh hay. On the crate by her stall lay a note in thick handwriting. "For now, you both belong here. Let's fix what's broken, properly this time." Under the note, a set of keys. For the first time in days, Tommy smiled. He didn't know that the same morning, Charles was standing in a city office, signing papers he didn't read, delaying projects, canceling contracts, angering investors. The assistant beside him said, "Sir, this will cost millions." Charles only said, "Then maybe it's worth something." That night, he drove back to the stable. The lights were on. The boy was laughing softly as Grace nibbled at his sleeve. When Charles stepped inside, the laughter stopped, replaced by something gentler, acceptance, maybe gratitude. "You brought her back," Tommy said. "I just corrected a mistake," Charles replied. The boy nodded, and for a while, neither spoke. The world outside their fragile circle could keep its opinions, its headlines, its appetite for noise. Inside this stall, there was only breath, straw, and the quiet work of trust beginning again. The next morning came with the clatter of trucks and men carrying beams. The stable that had once smelled of dust and despair now filled with the metallic scent of nails and sawdust. Charles stood in the middle of it all, wearing rolled-up sleeves instead of a suit jacket. A carpenter hammered at the cracked door frame, and with every strike, the echo filled the hollow spaces of his life. Tommy watched from a corner, eyes wide. "You're really fixing it?" he asked, still unsure if this was another temporary kindness that would vanish with daylight. Charles didn't look up. "We're fixing it," he corrected, motioning for the boy to help sweep away splinters. Grace, tethered loosely, turned her head to follow the rhythm. Each blow startled her at first, but Charles noticed that when Tommy murmured softly, "Easy, girl, It's only sound. She calmed, ears flicking, breath slowing. By noon, the hammer no longer frightened her. The stable was becoming something new, one nail at a time. "Why do all this?" Tommy asked. "You could build condos here and make millions." Charles smiled faintly. "I've built enough walls in my life. Time to leave a door open." The workers finished the roof repairs and left by evening. Silence returned, this time cleaner, less heavy. Charles sat on an overturned bucket, watching the horse chew. "She's tougher than she looks," he said. "So are you?" Tommy replied, without thinking. The words landed gently but stayed there, in the air between them. For the first time, Charles didn't wave them away. He pulled out a small leather pouch from his coat and handed it to the boy. Inside was a worn stopwatch, the kind used at races. The backplate was engraved with a single word: Evelyn. "My wife," Charles said quietly. "She used to time every race, said a heartbeat could change everything." Tommy turned it over in his palms like something sacred. "It's beautiful." "She'd have liked you," Charles added. "You listen." The boy smiled shyly. "That's easy. People talk too much." A few days later, Grace managed her first short walk around the yard. Her limp was less pronounced, her head held higher. The neighborhood kids gathered by the fence again, but this time they watched in silence. Even the air felt different, hopeful but fragile, like glass just cooled from the furnace. Charles leaned on the railing beside Tommy. "You know," he said, "I used to think the sound of success was applause." He gestured toward the mare's steady steps. "Turns out it's this." Tommy tilted his head. "What?" "The sound of something broken learning to move again." News spread fast once more, but this time it wasn't scandal. It was fascination. The same reporters who had mocked them now returned for redemption stories. "The vain foundation for second chances," one headline said. Charles didn't correct them. He just asked Tommy, "Do you want them to film her?" Tommy hesitated. "If it helps others, maybe." They agreed to one interview, filmed quietly in the afternoon light. The reporter asked Tommy what made him believe he could heal a horse. He thought for a moment, eyes on Grace. "I didn't try to heal her," he said softly. "I just stayed." That clip went viral overnight. Millions of views, shares, sponsorship offers. Words like compassion, healing, resilience, and even best insurance for hope appeared in captions. The world loved its miracles, especially when they fit in 30 seconds. But fame has its own gravity. The next week, investors called Charles, worried he'd lost focus. The board demanded explanations. "You're risking everything for sentiment," they told him. He looked out the glass window of his high-rise office, the city stretching beneath him like a spreadsheet of ambition. He thought of the hammer strikes, the dust, the mare's quiet breath. "Maybe that's what sentiment is for," he said finally. "To remind us there's something worth losing." He resigned that night. No announcements, no press release, just a handwritten note left on his desk. "I'm done selling roofs when people need shelter." When he returned to the stable, Tommy was asleep in the straw, Grace standing guard over him. Charles spread his coat over the boy's shoulders and sat nearby. The horse shifted her weight, tail flicking. The wind carried the distant hum of traffic, steady, endless, indifferent. "You did good, girl," he whispered again. The phrase felt easier now, almost natural. Grace's ear twitched in acknowledgement. The following morning, Charles drove to the city council to request ownership transfer of the land under the old racetrack. He proposed a sanctuary, a real one. They laughed at first, then read the donation figure he'd written. Laughter turned to silence. Within hours, paperwork began. Back at the stable, Tommy practiced leading Grace through the open gate. Each day, one more step farther down the old track. "We'll race again," he told her, "but not to win, just to show we can." When Charles returned that evening, he found them standing under the scoreboard, faded numbers ghosted on its surface. The boy looked up at him. "I think she remembers this place," he said. "Maybe she remembers who she was," Charles replied. The sun sank behind the bleachers, and for a brief moment, the world looked golden again, like the days when Evelyn would clap from the stands, shouting Grace's name. Charles closed his eyes. He could almost hear her laugh carried on the wind. Then came the sound, a single metallic bang, sharp and final. One of the workers had dropped a steel bar onto the track. The echo cracked the stillness. Grace startled violently, pulling free from the rope, galloping with a desperate limp down the lane. "Grace!" Tommy shouted, running after her. Charles sprinted too, heart pounding, lungs burning. The mare veered toward the fence, stumbled and collapsed on the grass. Dust rose around her like smoke. By the time they reached her, she was trembling, eyes wide with panic. Tommy fell to his knees, voice shaking. "She's bleeding again." Charles knelt beside him. "Easy," he said, though his own hands shook. He pressed the cloth to the wound, whispering the same words the boy once used. "It's okay. Breathe with me." Grace's breathing slowed, the wildness fading. When the vet arrived an hour later, she was stable, but weak. "She needs rest," the vet said, "more than before." Tommy's eyes filled with tears. "I scared her. I shouldn't have." Charles placed a hand on his shoulder. "No, son. The world's full of noise. You can't stop it. You just teach her, teach yourself, not to run from every sound." That night, they sat outside the stable under a moon that looked tired but kind. The hammering was done, but the echo lingered in their chests, the sound of repair, of risk, of everything fragile trying to hold. "Do you think she'll race again?" Tommy asked. Charles thought for a long moment. "Maybe not," he said, "but she already won something better." The boy frowned. "What's that?" "She learned someone would stay." In the distance, the wind carried faint noises from the city. Car horns, laughter, advertisements promising best mortgage rates and life insurance you can trust. The world kept selling certainty. But inside that quiet yard, they had found something rarer. The uncertain grace of staying. The morning after the accident, the stable smelled of antiseptic and wet straw. Grace lay on a thick bed of hay, her leg wrapped again in white gauze that already showed faint stains of red. Tommy hadn't slept. He sat beside her, head resting against her neck, eyes raw from exhaustion. Every few minutes he'd whisper her name, not as a plea but as a rhythm, the only way he knew to keep her anchored to this world. Charles stood at the doorway, a paper cup of coffee cooling in his hand. He had made 1,000 deals, signed away land and futures without hesitation, but he couldn't command the simplest thing now, the strength to speak. Finally, he said, "She's breathing better." Tommy didn't move. "She's scared." "We all are," Charles admitted. He walked closer, crouched beside the boy. "She'll heal again." Tommy looked up, his voice a whisper. "And if she doesn't?" Charles took a long breath. then we'll still show up. Outside, the city began its usual hum. Trucks, horns, a faint echo of a radio ad promising affordable car insurance and peace of mind. But here, time moved differently. The boy and the man worked in silence, replacing bandages, spooning water into the horse's mouth, waiting between every breath as if life itself needed permission to continue. As evening fell, Charles stepped outside. The air smelled of rain. A single light glowed in his car, his phone vibrating on the dashboard. It was his former business partner, leaving another message. "You're destroying your legacy, Charles. Investors are leaving. You can't fix the world with sentiment." He didn't reply. Legacy meant nothing if it didn't include mercy. Inside, Tommy hummed the same wordless tune as before. Grace's ear twitched at the sound. "See," he said softly. "She still listens." "She listens to you," Charles said. "She listens to anyone who means it." That night, a storm passed, not with thunder, but with wind, strong enough to rattle the roof and stir the dust. The hammer and nails they'd used days earlier creaked in protest. Water slipped through a small crack and landed in a bucket by the stall, one drop at a time. The rhythm filled the dark like a metronome marking all they hadn't said. "You should go home," Charles told him. "I don't want her to wake up alone." The man nodded. He understood too well the fear of waking to absence. He sat down on the floor beside him. "Then neither of us will." Hours passed. Rain softened to drizzle. At some point, Tommy fell asleep against the straw, head tilted toward the mare's shoulder. Charles draped a blanket over him. He reached for Grace's muzzle, her breath warm against his palm. "Stay with us," he whispered, unsure if he was talking to the horse, the boy, or himself. When morning came, the air carried the scent of wet earth and something new. Hope, maybe, or acceptance. Grace stood on trembling legs, shifting her weight carefully. The sunlight caught her mane, scattering gold through the air. Tommy rubbed his eyes and smiled through the fatigue. "You see? She's trying again." Charles smiled back soon. "She always does." But there was something else that morning. A letter pinned to the stable door, official seal stamped in red. Notice of eviction. Property transfer pending. The sanctuary land had been sold overnight, the investors moving faster than he could stop them. Charles's throat tightened. He tore the letter down before Tommy could see it, crumpling it into his fist. "We'll figure something out," he muttered, more prayer than plan. By noon, rumors spread that demolition would resume within days. The workers who had once cheered their progress now avoided his gaze. One whispered apology as he left. "Orders from the new owners, sir." Tommy overheard enough. "They're taking it away again, aren't they?" Charles didn't answer. The boy's voice shook. "Why does everything good have to go?" Charles sat beside him, elbows on his knees. "Because good things cost something," he said slowly. "And most people don't want to pay." "Then why do you?" He smiled faintly. "Because someone once stayed when I didn't deserve it." He reached into his coat and handed the boy an envelope. Inside was a folded deed and a key. "It's in your name," he said. "You'll finish what we started." Tommy stared at the paper, uncomprehending. "You mean, this is mine?" "Ours," Charles corrected. "But if anything happens to me, it stays yours." The boy's eyes filled with tears. "You can't just give me—" "I can," Charles said, firm but gentle. "Because someday you'll understand what it means to leave something standing when everything else falls." That evening, they led Grace outside for a short walk. Her steps were slow but sure, each hoof pressing softly into the damp ground. The world around them shimmered with the glow of streetlights reflected in puddles. For the first time in a long while, there was no noise, no traffic, no shouting, no hammering. Just breath, wind, and the low hum of life continuing despite orders and signatures. "You ever miss the city?" Tommy asked. Charles chuckled. "It's still there. I mean the part that makes you forget you're human." The man looked at him, surprised by the question. "Every day." They reached the fence, and Grace stopped. She stared into the open field, where weeds swayed like soft applause. Charles rested his hand on her neck. "You've done enough for one day," he said. "She doesn't want to go back in," Tommy murmured. "Neither do I," Charles confessed. The boy turned to him. "Then let's just stay." They stood there as the wind carried the faint hum of a radio ad again. Protect what matters most: life, love, and legacy. It almost sounded like a blessing. Later that night, after Tommy had gone home to tell his mother the impossible news, Charles remained. The moon rose, full and pale, hanging low over the stable. He looked at the battered roof, the patched boards, the horse sleeping inside, and the empty stretch of land beyond. He realized how quiet the world could be when a man finally stopped trying to own it. The next day, the eviction crews came early. But they found no resistance, only a folded note taped to the door. It read, "Do not destroy what has already begun to heal." Underneath, the new deed was attached. Signed, sealed, legally binding. The property no longer belonged to any corporation. It belonged to the boy who believed a broken horse could stand again. The foreman read it twice, frowned, and said, "Guess we're out of a job." Grace snorted from her stall as if approving. That evening, when Tommy returned, Charles was gone. On the stall rail hung his coat, the one he always wore. In its pocket, the stopwatch with Evelyn's name engraved. The second hand still ticked, steady, patient, measuring not time, but the cost of silence finally paid in full. The boy stood there for a long time, listening to its rhythm, the same steady beat he had once taught Grace to follow. He smiled through his tears. "He stayed," he whispered. "He really stayed." And somewhere, in the quiet corners of the world that rarely make the news, a sanctuary began. Months passed. Spring returned to the outskirts of the city, softening the cold edges of the land that once echoed with demolition. The old racetrack was unrecognizable now, grass sprouting where concrete had cracked, paint peeling into gentle patterns of time. Over the gate hung a new sign, hand-carved and uneven. Grace Sanctuary. Beneath it, in smaller letters, founded in memory of Charles Vane and Evelyn. Every morning, Tommy unlocked the same door Charles once tested twice before leaving. Grace, older but calm, greeted him with a low nicker. Her coat shone again, scars visible but clean, as if her body refused to hide what it had survived. He brushed her carefully, humming that wordless tune the man used to say reminded him of forgiveness. The sanctuary had grown quietly. There were now 3 horses rescued from auctions, 1 mule from a bankrupt farm, and 2 volunteers who came on weekends to help. Nothing grand, nothing for show. just a place where living things could breathe without being asked to earn it. Tommy's mother worked in the small office by the barn, handling calls and donations. "Some insurance company wants to sponsor the roof," she said one day, smiling. "Says they want to protect Hope now." She rolled her eyes. "Marketing." Tommy laughed. "Let them try. Maybe Hope needs better coverage." He spent the afternoons walking Grace through the field, letting her lead the way. She still limped slightly, but she moved with quiet confidence, as though she'd made peace with the uneven rhythm. "It's not about being fast," he'd say to the kids who sometimes came to visit. "It's about being free." One afternoon, as the sun lowered behind the trees, a car pulled up by the gate. It was old, the paint dull, the engine wheezing. A woman stepped out, gray hair, soft eyes, and a folded newspaper in her hand. "Are you Tommy?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." She smiled, handing him the paper. It was an old clipping, yellowed at the edges. On the front page, the headline read, "The Boy Who Gave a Broken Horse a Second Life." Below it, a photo of Charles standing behind Tommy and Grace, both caught in sunlight. The woman's hand trembled slightly as she pointed to the man in the picture. "That was my brother," she said. "Charles Vane." Tommy's breath caught. "You're Evelyn's sister," she said softly. "I never met you, but he wrote about you in his last letter. Said you taught him what mercy sounds like." She looked around the sanctuary, eyes filling. "He never stopped building things. I used to think he did it to prove he was strong, but now I see. He was just trying to find somewhere safe enough for silence." Tommy didn't know what to say. He showed her the stopwatch that still ticked in his pocket. "He left this." She nodded. "He carried that every race. Said time only matters if you fill it with the right kind of people." They stood together in the doorway, the smell of hay and warm air around them. Grace lifted her head, ears pricking forward. The woman smiled faintly. "That's her?" "That's Grace," Tommy said. "The one who stayed." She stepped forward, careful and slow. The mare lowered her head, breathing against her palm. "Charles always said Evelyn was the brave one," the woman whispered. "I think he was wrong." That evening, after she left, Tommy walked alone to the far side of the field. He stopped at the small wooden marker near the old scoreboard. It wasn't a grave. Charles had been cremated, his ashes scattered in the soil where Grace had once fallen. But the boy had placed a plaque there anyway. For the man who stayed. He sat down in the grass, the stopwatch ticking quietly in his hand. The sky above him bled into gold, then violet. The hum of traffic from the city reached him faintly, like the sea heard from a distance. "We made it, sir," he said softly. "She's still standing." Grace wandered toward him, pressing her nose against his shoulder. "You miss him too?" he asked. The mare breathed out, long and low. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." The sanctuary grew slowly by word of mouth and the generosity of strangers who had once been skeptics. Volunteers brought supplies. Vets donated time. Even a local mortgage company helped fund the expansion, branding it an investment in kindness. Tommy didn't care about the slogans. He cared about the quiet between the walls, the kind that Charles had taught him to protect. Years later, the newspapers would call him the youngest founder of an animal rehabilitation project in the state. They'd print polished photos of him shaking hands, smiling for cameras, but he always returned to the same place at dusk. The stall where Grace had once been broken. He'd sit beside her, or what time had left of her, and whisper the same thing he had the first night they met. You just need time. On the 5th anniversary of the sanctuary, the sky turned the same color it had the day Charles left. A crowd gathered, donors, neighbors, children from nearby schools. There was laughter, applause, even a brass band that played slightly out of tune. Tommy stood at the podium, uncomfortable with the attention. When it was his turn to speak, he said only this: "This place wasn't built by money. It was built by mistakes that didn't stay mistakes. A man once told me that broken doesn't mean useless. It just means waiting for someone to stay." He looked at Grace, grazing behind the crowd. We stayed. That's all. After the ceremony, he returned to the field alone. The air was thick with the smell of rain about to fall. He looked toward the skyline where towers shimmered faintly through the haze. Charles's old empire, still standing. For the first time, he didn't resent it. He understood that the man hadn't built those towers out of greed, but out of longing. For permanence, for forgiveness, for one thing that wouldn't crumble. Now he had both. The skyline for memory, the sanctuary for meaning. As night settled, Tommy sat beside Grace one last time, the stopwatch ticking between them. The seconds passed steady as breath. Somewhere in the distance, an advertisement echoed from a passing truck. Protect what you love, because love is worth the risk. He smiled. He'd have liked that one. The wind moved through the grass, and for a moment he could almost hear Charles's voice carried in it. Rough, patient, familiar. You did good, kid. Tommy looked toward the horizon, eyes wet but calm. We both did. When the first drops of rain began to fall, he didn't move. He let it wash over him, over the field, over the place that used to be a racetrack and was now something gentler. The world didn't need to know his name. It just needed to know that somewhere, a man who had given away a dying horse found his own salvation in return. And in that silence, steady, alive, infinite, the stopwatch kept ticking. If this story touched your heart, tell me what part stayed with you the most. Leave a comment below. I read every one of them. And if you'd like to hear more true, soul-warming stories like this, make sure to hit like and subscribe. There's another one waiting for you next week.